How are we doing?
Not good.
How come? What do you mean not good?
Everything. Homework and friends.
Almost makes you want to cry, right?
Can't find anything.
Yeah.
You can join our study group on Saturdays.
Tell you, the study groups are,
Awesome.
you don't leave home without them, right? Study groups are absolutely necessary in this class of thing. When you're on your own, it makes it so much harder. But here's the nice thing about finance. Do you know why, even though you want to cry, do you know why you don't?
Knowing that we'll make some money in the end.
Well, maybe there's that too, but there's no crying in finance. There's no crying in finance. Okay, so what I want to do tonight is talk for a few minutes, if you would like, about the problem set that you're just turning in. I think there might be two of them actually. Is that right?
Yeah.
You're turning in the second half of the using WAC and CAPM. I believe you're turning in project investment selection. And if you have questions on either of those, feel free and let's discuss them. And then we're going to move on and talk about frameworks for valuation. We'll review the free cash flow model, the KVD model, and which I think I've kind of hinted to or talked about with you before, but we'll go over those again. And then I'm going to introduce the forward market multiple model. And this is the first time that we'll have introduced multiples or valuation multiples as a model form into your set. And then we'll look at a case, or rather a problem set, using the free cash flow and the KVD model. And then hopefully we'll get time to start to talk about forecast ratios. I think we will. I'm not too concerned about it. So with that, what kind of questions might you have? Please, Rory.
On CAPM and WAC, we have questions, because our table of, I don't know exactly how to say it, looks exactly like how you had it on the solution set.
Mm-hmm.
But it almost seems like our discount rate was different.
Okay.
Or
How-
something.
How
Yeah, really.
different were your outcomes?
Like dollars off.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you calculate the WAC using your spreadsheet and let it have an internally generated number that has full numeric fidelity, so even though you may only see 2 or 3 decimal points, it's got all of them, right? You're going to find that it is slightly different than if you did it on your calculator and just wrote it down, right? I think that it's, is it 0.094? Is that the calculated WAC?
Yeah.
Okay, wait, and it's actually 0.0938724, blah, blah, blah. And when you're dealing with meaningful size values, which we absolutely are, then being off by dollars, who cares?
Okay.
Okay,
So
so if you are that close, Robert, you can't be wrong. I mean, or you're extraordinarily lucky, okay? Which I've known you for a while, not so much of that. So I just, you can't get that close on something so complex and be wrong.
Okay, so if we submit it without it being exactly 100% as how you had it, that's okay.
Yes, in fact, let me kind of reiterate this, and some of you I know have this already ingrained, some not. On these problem sets, I don't expressly look for all your highly detailed right answers. Oh, I want you to get them, right? But the reason I don't look for them is because if you didn't do the work, you can have the right answer anyway, because you got the right answers online. They're right there. So I don't adjudicate these for that. I pretty much just look at these to see, did they do the work? I can't tell if they did it honestly or not, but I will be able to tell there is a day of reckoning of which you're aware, right? And in which if you don't know your stuff, all of a sudden I'm going to realize you were snowing you and me on those things, and woe be unto you, because I am a vengeful SOB when it comes to that kind of thing. Okay? So don't worry about that stuff.
Okay.
If you're within a spitting distance, then start spitting your millions of dollars. It's all good. Okay? What else? Please, Chris.
So that was number 8, I believe, for the cap and the WAC.
Yeah.
Okay?
And then number 10, where you used the KVD formula.
Yep.
So me personally, I don't know about the others, I'm off by 20 millions for the present value DCF.
Oh.
So if I get that one right,
Okay.
the others, the continuing value and the present value, continuing value, all those would be correct.
Okay, so let's see here. Why are you so different? So
which
for
one?
number 8, did you get the right PVDCF value?
Yeah.
Well, for number 9, or rather number 10, they're the exact same value. So I'm a little bit confused as to why you got a different number. Because PVDCF using the same cash flows and discount rate should be PVDCF using the same cash flows and discount rate. So you may have an input that's off there. Now, your continuing value
That's
will
different,
certainly,
yeah.
will
That's
certainly.
where I went wrong.
Okay, why is the continuing value different when we're using the key value driver form? Speak up, Shelby.
I said it counts for.
Who cares? Come on. Okay. It counts for ROIC. Let me put up the construct we've seen a number of times now. Free cash flow being equal to plat plus depreciation minus change in net working capital minus net capital spending. That is the traditional free cash flow formulation, and it is the free cash flow formulation we've used in the explicit period for both the free cash flow model and the KVD model, right? But when we get to the KVD formation of the continuing value, then we diverge from this definition and start to talk about free cash flow being equal to no plat times 1 minus G divided by ROIC. And we use this formation in what cases? When do we use that formation of free cash flow? There's only a couple of very specific times.
When it's
Shelby?
instructed.
When we're using the KVD continuing value part, not the explicit part of KVD, but the continuing value. What's the other one?
When you're told to.
When you're told, that's exactly right, and there's actually a third that we really haven't talked about much yet. Does anybody remember? Well, not a terminal value, but when we're thinking about a valuation multiple. The terminal value of KVD and the continuing value for KVD is the exact same thing. Those are interchangeable terms, okay? So, let's think about this first equation, and it's going to help us reveal again why the second will end up being different, okay? When we have change in net working capital, so the net working capital from one year to the next and the percent change between them, we see some element of the firm's growth or shrinkage, percent change for that year, right? Change in their net is the change in their current assets versus the change in their current liabilities. That's what this is in the change in net working capital, right? So we're seeing some element of the firm's growth for the particular year in which we're assessing this value. And when we see the change in net capital spending, or when we see net capital spending, we're actually seeing the change in the firm's fixed assets adjusted for its depreciation. So if you think about it, in between these two variables, we've seen the entirety of the change in the firm's assets for that particular year, haven't we? And we've also seen the change in the firm's current liabilities. This you can think of as being reflective of some growth. It would be the growth of the firm's assets, right? Well, if a firm uses its assets to create revenue, and a derivative of revenue is free cash flow, right? Then we're looking at a growth rate of some kind for that year. And as it turns out, you can calculate that growth rate in the G is equal to IR, investment rate, investment rate times ROIC. So you can calculate that growth that you're having hinted to you here. because in fact, this change essentially is the IR with an adjustment for ROIC. Okay? That said, when we take and determine some G that is just a specific percentage, I think in this case, was it 5%? What was the long-term G we used in this particular case? 4, okay. So when we say G, I'm going to do it in a different color purposely. When we say G is equal to 4%, what is that G supposed to tell us? What's it represent? Colin?
Future growth?
Future growth of the cash flow variable that is the subject of our assessment. Okay? If this is future growth in red, if in red up here though, I get some hinted growth for the particular period in time in which this cash flow is being adjudicated, which period of time is the base year, right? Not future years. I'm seeing a growth that's reflective of that year, not our perpetual period, our continuation period. Okay? And in order for a particular year's free cash flow calculated in the first equation to equal the free cash flow calculated in the second, this G must be the G inferred here, and it must be the G calculated from G equals IR times ROIC. This 4% is simply an estimate not intended for the base year, because the base year we know exactly, don't we? It's not even intended for the explicit forecast years. It's intended for our very long run growth in our perpetuity format, and that's on our continuing value. So if you use this G by calculation, which I think in this was it 11.5%?
What?
Was this G 11.5% by calculation? Or was that was in the math of value creation, wasn't it? Okay, sorry about that. If you use this G here, and the no plat was from the same period, and the ROIC was from that same period, you would get the same free cash flow. Okay? Get very clear on that. Because if you're not, it will trip you up when you least expect it to. Get very clear. There is a growth reflected in this number, or in those numbers, right? Because they're changes from one period to the next. So change is a growth, right? Hopefully it's growth and not a shrinkage. But I use growth as a general term to represent percent change, positive or negative. It is going to be reflected in this same number, because if you take and deconstruct these variables, IR and ROIC, they are reflected in here. ROIC is no plat divided by invested capital, right? That's ROIC. What's invested capital? Current assets and fixed assets. So all of this is embodied in this red or this more traditional equation. So just try to get clear on it. Yeah, please.
So you're saying with number 8, with us being off by a few dollars, that'll also make us off by a few dollars with,
Oh, yeah.
with number 10 then, right?
To
Okay.
Vita, a few dollars, and when you are dealing with tens of millions of dollars, do I even notice a $1,000 difference? It's a rounding error, not even within my purview or my sensitivity assessment. Now, I should also tell you that when you're doing the homeworks, the quizzes, I have set up the responses to accept a range of values. It looks like it's looking for one value, and it is looking for one value, but it'll accept a range because sometimes you're 0.01 off or 0.02 off in these percentage figures that may result to, in some cases, $10 million off in your absolute numbers when we're dealing with billions of dollars of stuff. When you're dealing with billions of dollars, do you think we care about 10 million? Doesn't that sound silly? Right? When we're dealing with $10 billion, I couldn't care less about 10 million. It's a rounding error. Go talk to somebody else. Okay? I know that just sounds silly. That's why Kennedy said, you know, billion here, a billion there, pretty soon we're talking about real money. What else? These are good questions, by the way. Good problems to have.
So I used
Chris?
your template for, so that's actually the one I got wrong, not the first one I told you about. That's
Okay.
just me trying to figure something out.
So,
But I used the template, and for continuing value for the KVD,
Yep.
so it's a no plat of 26,500,000 times 1 minus G divided by ROIC,
Okay.
then divided by discount rate minus growth.
1
again.
plus the discount rate.
Well,
Oh,
it's the-
WACC minus G, discount rate minus G, excuse me.
yeah.
Got it. Okay.
And that gets me a couple million off, actually, 14 million off. But I was trying to use your template as good as
Did
possible.
Did you input by hand some of the input values, or are they calculated every place?
They are calculated.
Let's take a look at that when we break.
Yeah.
I want to take a look and see where you're off there. And, because it may simply be the way that I input versus you, or vice versa.
So a few
Yeah,
millions
I
should
was
be
saying.
when
Yeah, we have this.
What's the end number, Nazin? How big is the number that you're ending up with?
and billions.
Billions?
Yeah.
Yeah, a few million,
Yeah, no, yeah, I'm just.
rounding error.
It's
My
just.
wife's been on last week. No,
I
no,
mean,
no,
because,
no.
I mean, if we're all using Excel and the same equations, I'm just trying to fixate on that. Why?
Because sometimes the equations and answers you're seeing may have had hand inputs
Okay.
rather than calculations, or vice versa. Maybe you did hand inputs rather than calculate. Okay? There's a sensitivity issue here, and we might think this is silly for $5 million difference to be accurate. But if it is expressed by seeing it in the third decimal place of a percentage, maybe that's why. It's not that you're wrong, it's just that you didn't pick up that sensitivity issue. Now, you might, in an actual negotiation, argue about $10 million. Fine. Are the numbers that we come up with in valuations, are they exactly the number that must be paid for the asset?
No.
No, there's no law that says that's the number that must be paid for the asset. Are they a target number that you might want to offer or a firm might want to receive based upon how you've constructed them? It's a generalized, specified guess. It's a suggestion. To beat it?
well, I think just on your previous assignments and then with the practice homework, like we went out with these models together, just like nail all of your examples, like, but it was just 8 and 10 where we were just off by a little bit.
Yeah.
Where we were kind of bugged because,
Well, let's look at those numbers on break and let's see if there's something more fundamental that I'm missing at the moment.
okay.
But my guess is it's not.
Right, yeah,
My guess
that's
is
what it
where you're gonna see it and say, oh, okay,
Yeah,
no big
we
deal,
used
no
to-
wonder it doesn't bother.
We're used to like hitting the numbers that you have in
Yeah.
examples, and like now
Okay.
we're running into like.
We'll
getting
take a look.
close. That's
In the
where it's like-
problem sets, in class ICPs, you're more likely to see that. When I write the ICP, you can appreciate I probably do all of it with spreadsheets, right? But when I type them up, I have to round to 2 or 3 decimal points, right? And so we began, and then I make sure that my answers, I try to make sure my answers are accurate based upon the inputs I've typed onto the page, which could be a little bit different than if you're using the spreadsheet.
Right.
So there's kind of an inherent issue when I change mediums here.
Yeah, right.
But thanks for pointing that out. Again, we'll look at this on the break and we'll see if there's something more fundamental that I'm missing. It's altogether possible. Okay? So let's now move off of this and talk about frameworks for evaluation, which I believe we actually began last week. What is the most basic form of the valuation equation? It's the most generalized form, right? Yeah. That I give you. Yes. Apparently we're playing guess what's on my mind. I'm sorry. Certainly my intent. Okay. So val at time 0 is equal to the present value of some discounted cash flow plus the present value of some continuing value. So when I ask you the generalized form, that's actually what I'm looking at. Your answer wasn't wrong, because the reality is that is embedded in this. Okay? And we know that the present value of some discounted cash flow, in this case I'm going to use free cash flow as my example, is equal to the sum of some free cash flows at times I, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever the number of years of our explicit period happens to be, divided by 1 plus, and I'll use WACC as the discount rate, WACC to the T. Okay? And the continuing value is equal to, when we're using the free cash flow model, is equal to the free cash flow in time 1 divided by WACC minus G, such that the present value of the continuing value at continuing value times 0 is equal to the continuing value times 0 at, or divided by 1 plus WACC to the T. Okay? Clear as mud, right? It's actually not too bad when you write it without numbers. Start to put those pesky little numbers in there and your life changes a little bit. Let's make sure that we're all very clear on these time signatures. Let's assume for a moment we have an explicit period that goes out to 4 years. And by the way, what do I mean by explicit period?
Where you can set the growth rate is.
Well, be a little more finite, a little more fine-tuned than that.
This is where you can be the most accurate.
It is where we're the most accurate. It's the closest to now, right? Further away from now we get, the more we're really guessing. And by the way, what is a WAG? Say it?
Wild ass guess.
Yeah, that's a technical term, by the way.
Okay, we use it in aviation. word.
Yes. Well, and frankly, a forecast cash flow 5 years from now.
That's a whack.
Thank you. A forecast cash flow 37 years from now, which you might think, oh, you would never forecast, but we do in our continuation term, don't we? That's a exponential WAG, if you will, okay? So, we're going to, in this case, say we have a 4-year explicit period. The explicit period is the period of time for which we explicitly or expressly forecast our cash flows by forecasting revenue, forecasting expenses, forecasting capital needs, debt, current assets, current liabilities, fixed assets, such that we can end up with a free cash flow that we have, with as much detail as humanly possible, forecast. And we only go to 4 or 5 or so years, because beyond that, we have to be non-human to be correct. Matthew, looks like you had a question.
Yes. And the real world is the forecast. Is that dependent on how much history? Is there like an equation that you can, or an estimate to give you that, depending on how much history you have?
Yeah. So I believe next week we're going to get into this in detail, and I think I'm going to try to spend some time tonight, because the first thing we have to forecast is our revenue, right? Everything flows from revenue. Maybe exactly or maybe generally, but everything flows from revenue. So the first thing we have to forecast is our revenue. Well, how do I think about forecasting revenue? Well, I know my R&D pipeline, I know my customers, I know my history, but history isn't a perfect teller or of the future, but it certainly informs us of our future, right? Because at the end of the day, we are path-dependent beings as managers, investors, and firms, okay? But that doesn't mean it tells the whole story. So we have to think about what's our capacity, where we've been, what's our management team like, what are our resources like, what's our trajectory like, and then you have to flavor it. What do we think is happening in our marketplace next year, the year after? Here we are, 11 years into economic expansion post the financial crisis. Do you suppose that the current expansion is likely to continue for 11 more? My guess is not. My hope is it will, but I hope for Easter bunnies and Santa Claus and all that kind of stuff too, right? So I'm pretty confident that we'll see some slowdown or some alteration, some bobble, hopefully not a crisis. You're living through a couple of those in your lifetime, more than enough. I don't need another one, okay, neither do you. Dot-com bubble darn near put me into a coma, and followed by the financial crisis, I was just about done. Okay, but here I'm back. I used to have hair. Okay, but we have to think about that. Well, do I think what's happening next year? No, I'm pretty sure that's not. The year after, I don't think so. The year after, I might start to slow some of my growth expectations for the third year out because I'm hedging that bet a little bit. Maybe I'd do the same thing in the fourth year out. If I think that we're facing something like that, I'm going to cut my explicit period relatively short and move to a 2.5, 3.5-ish, whatever % long-term G, just to make the adjustment for it. However, if we've just come off of a financial crisis or a slowdown, and I see that we're in the earliest stages of a recovery or an expansion, I might be very comfortable giving myself a fairly substantial growth rate for the next 5 years. So you got to think about conditions. You got to think about what's happening with global trade. We have a bobble in the global trade markets right now. What is it? Could be devastating. What is it?
Technology?
Pardon?
Technology?
Not technology. Tariffs. Tariffs. So some of you know that I'm on the phone with different firms in Italy and agencies in Italy almost every morning at the moment. And almost every call, I'm being asked questions about tariffs. And those questions usually start something like, what are you guys thinking? And my response is, I don't know. Because the economists are not making these decisions. Okay? Economists would not apply tariffs. Populists, trade protectionists, etc. perhaps would. And maybe for good reasons. Okay? So you got to think about these things. What's the expected outcome in your industry? Are you an industry that's a growth industry? Mobility applications? Growth industry, right? Or are you in the garage door industry? Which, nothing wrong with garage doors. Hey, Kevin. Nothing wrong with garage doors. Profitable businesses, right? But I don't think that unless you've come up with a new kind of Shazam whiz bang garage door, you probably have a modest growth industry that almost certainly simply follows new construction with a kicker for remodel. So you got to think about your industry. You got to think about your position in the industry. Are you a leader? Are you a follower? Is your industry being commodified because there's so many players and there's no profit left in it? So all kinds of things go into this, okay? Including, what are your expansion plans? We've bypassed sources of growth and ROIC the last couple of weeks. So let's actually get into a couple of minutes of it now because we're kind of naturally going there. I'm going off my points for a few moments. And I feel comfortable doing that because I've already pretty well shared with you the free cash flow and KDB models. You already know them at least well enough for what we're doing today. If you're trying to grow your business, what are the three basic, four perhaps, sources of growth or areas of growth that you might be able to think about? What do you think? Pardon?
Are you looking at it from a finance term or like SWOT analysis?
What area of growth is that?
Yeah, where is growth likely to come from?
R&D,
R&D sales, okay, so is R&D organic to the firm? It's endogenous to your firm, it's created from within your firm?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So it's endogenous, it's organic, so we can think about growth. And this is not expressly G equaling IR times ROIC or something, but they're not terribly separated because those forms of G that we talk about come from this. They may not be the same numbers, but they come from these activities, right? So I think we can reasonably believe that organic growth from the firm is a very common place where we find growth. Our R&D, research and development, innovation, our willingness to invest new capital of ours, reinvest our retained earnings in the company, right? Marketing programs, just trying to get better at what we do, more aggressive, more assertive, more refined. We always do that, right? Any company that succeeds has organic growth on their mind all the time. It's not the only place we can get growth though, right? So one of the things about organic growth that we like is it tends to be a less expensive form of growth. One of the things that we don't like is it tends to take a while. R&D doesn't happen like that, right? Investing our retained earnings, well, first we had to earn them, then we had to plan them, and our board of directors, all this kind of stuff takes time. So a pro is inexpensive. We didn't have to go from outside to get it. A con is it takes a while. Okay. What's an alternative to organic growth? Internal growth. Pardon?
Acquisitions.
Acquisitions? So M&A. Mergers and acquisitions. M&A. Here's an interesting thing. Mergers and acquisitions are one of the sexiest part of the investment banking and whole financial services Wall Street industry, right? I mean, it's where the sizzle lives. What's the problem with M&A transactions?
They,
Negotiation and take a while and prices change.
Well, they take a while, but not as long as organic growth,
Oh, yeah, definitely not.
right? But, so they're not necessarily immediate, but they're relatively immediate. That's not their problem, that's actually a pro. Somebody said it over here.
well, I didn't say anything, but very often it doesn't turn out the way it turns out.
Regulation.
Yeah. Now, is there a risk in R&D and trying to have organic growth?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, sure, sometimes you're wrong. Man, I got this great idea, and we decided to spend $50 million on it. And as it turns out, you thought it was a great idea, you're the board of directors, because I thought it was a great idea, and I happen to have been convincing on that particular day. Bummer for us all, because when we tried to take it to market, as it turns out, the idea was new Coke. New Coke, right? Was that an organic growth vehicle? Was it intended to be? It was endogenous. They did some research, they did the development, they did the marketing, it was going to give them all a new profit line, darn near killed them. Was Nike's signing of Kaepernick, I think that's what I call him?
Yeah.
Was that endogenous and organic? Sure, sure. A growth move, as it turns out?
Yeah.
Maybe not so much a growth move, maybe not so much maybe a shrinkage move, okay? So we're not always right. We're also not always right when it comes to M&A, right?
Yeah, their sales are up.
Say again?
Their sales are up, Nike
Yeah.
sales.
What's their, yeah, but I'm worried, I'm concerned about their stock price.
Yeah.
It's still off, right?
So wait and see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wait and see. You know what? Barnum said, I don't care what you print about me, just get my name right, okay? That, we may see that long term, because I think the word Nike's been on more people's lips, certainly in more text than it typically is. That may have some benefits all by its lonesome. We'll see, right? So, just like organic growth, inorganic or M&A does carry some risks. I'm not sure which is riskier. I just don't know. Maybe we could study it someday and know. Others probably have. I don't know. But here's what I do know. In organic growth, we might be able to tell early in the development process whether or not we're on the right path, or we might say, oh, whoa, stop. Stop. New Coke? Clear Pepsi? Are you kidding me? Who thought of this brew? And you might stop it before the blood really starts to gush from the aortas, okay? Whereas when you've got an M&A transaction going, I come to Elisa and we agree that I'm going to acquire her company for $500 million, and she causes me to sign an agreement that if I back out, it's going to cost me 50 mil just because of all the time and effort that she and all her people, etc., have put into it. You've heard about these, right? I back out, I still got a $50 million price tag. And the only thing I have to show for it is embarrassment. And by the way, you're mad. You're mad, right?
But I
Okay.
made $50 million.
Pardon?
But I made $50 million.
Yeah, which is why I'm embarrassed, okay? Now, so risk, I don't know which is more, but the speed at which the risk may be addressed is very, very different. The dynamics, the temporal dynamics of it may be very different. Are M&A transactions inexpensive?
No.
Let's think about it for a minute. So over here, you guys, Vita, Manny, and Kaibo, you happen to be investment bankers. And this $500 million transaction between our companies, you're the ones that have been charged with taking this to the markets. Are you going to make some money?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, please. Yeah, right? In fact, my guess is on a $50 million transaction, your fees are going to be upwards of 30 million, maybe 25 million. So not cheap, right? You guys, Colin, Kuhn, Junli, or Junyun, you are the attorneys. Are you guys going to make some money?
Oh, yes.
Oh, baby. In fact, you're not going to make as much money as these guys because your jobs aren't as sexy, okay? But you're going to make some money. You're probably going to charge about $10 million on my side and another 10 on hers. So you're not going to do too badly, right? You guys own the printing companies that have to print the truckloads of prospectuses that have to go out to your shareholders, my shareholders, all the K1s, all the you going to make some money? Okay. And you guys are the public relations experts that have to make sure that she and I don't kill each other in the press, and to the extent that we want to. And by the way, M&A transactions are marriages, and like any tensely, aggressively pursued relationship, they can become terse. Okay? It's part of why you guys are making 20 mil combined. Are y'all going to make some money as you are the publicists for this deal? Are M&A transactions inexpensive? They're terribly expensive. In fact, compared to organic growth with the same outcome, they are significantly more expensive. Add to that some of them are abject failures once the price tags have been committed to, makes it even harder, right? So why do companies like M&A?
Quick buck.
Just a quick buck.
For the CEOs as well, mainly.
Oh gosh, yes, right? Because I'm here to tell you, Elisa's board of directors promised her that if she could get a certain price for the company, she'd get a bonus that's going to make all of us happy. Well, not me, apparently I'm paying, okay? But yeah, so it's a quick buck. Remember organic? Less expensive, takes a long time. M&A, more expensive, takes a relatively short period of time. And unfortunately, in Western capitalism and American business, we've gotten used to measuring things in calendar quarters, right? And we want results now. And to an investor, a quarter is a very short period of time. To a trader, it's not, but to an investor, it is, okay? But we want it now. The boards want it now. We're subject to the markets now. And so we very often fall prey to this. Have we talked about the Franklin-Covey merger in this class at all? So you guys know who Franklin Day Planners was, right? Maybe you don't. You know who Franklin Covey is? Okay, so we're gonna go back in time for a few of you children. So in the 1980s, Franklin Day Planners was the preeminent provider of day planners, calendars, that we all kept because we didn't have the digital supercomputers that each of you have in front of you. Okay, and so we all kept them. In fact, some of us kept them with minute detail. I know that when I was a new broker in the early 1980s, I had a day planner on my desk. It not only controlled my schedule on one page as it was open, you can see 2 pages at once, right? Not only controlled my schedule on one page, but every transaction that I entered into had to be detailed on that and became a legal record. Today, that's all digital, right? These guys printed these things by the truckload. Sold all over the country, and there were entire seminar series and consulting apparatus that went along to help you become more efficient, because this was time planning, right? Well, we never planned time before, we just let it happen to us kind of thing. Okay? Well, about the same time, the Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, Stephen Covey's organization locally was making some waves with some really interesting and innovative ways to think about culture, organization inside firms, planning, getting the most out of resources. And they did this from a really kind of ethereal standpoint. And Franklin, by the way, was a local firm as well. Some of you know Senator Bob Bennett, or know the name Senator Bennett. Senator Bennett and a couple of other people were the founders of Franklin. So these guys were doing just fine. It's where Bennett got his fortune from, right? And somebody had the idea, wait a minute. You guys are dealing with planning and efficiency and consultancy. You guys are dealing with planning and efficiency and consultancy. As it turns out, you got a lot of the same value systems. You're in the same geography. What do you say you get married? And created Franklin Covey. They both were publicly held firms. They merged, created Franklin Covey, and as it turns out, the marriage made in heaven, actually I think was made in Primm, Nevada, which is as close as I've come to hell on this planet. Actually, I've been out in Goblin Valley as well, and that's awfully close as well, okay? So the cultures were horrible. They weren't aligned. Yeah, they had some of the same core values, but a lot of things were not, and it virtually ruined the company. Didn't put it into bankruptcy, but it ruined the company. Now, I think at the exact same time, the juice of technology, and that both of these companies hadn't ignored technology, but really hadn't embraced it as boldly as they should have, helped create a lot of the stress that made the marriage problematic. Okay? And today, Franklin Covey is kind of an afterthought. It was huge. There are warehouses on the other side of this valley, millions of square feet, that you've driven past on 215. Do you know where the big Decker Lake facility is with those big dark red brick buildings that are like 3 and 4 stories high, kind of pile on each other? You've probably seen them. That was the Franklin Covey headquarters. I mean, it was a big deal. It's an afterthought today. Because M&A transactions very, very often don't succeed. Okay? All right, so those are 2 forms of growth. Can you think of any others?
New markets.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, a local company could go international.
Okay, so let's think about this as expansion, which you might think of as organic, but there's an element of expansion that's inorganic. And that is, if 50 years ago, if I had wanted to take my Utah-based company and expand into China, 50 years ago, could I have done so? No way. Illegal, and had it not been supply chains, communication, the ability to manage something here that's happening there, we had digital nothing. I think we're still using telegraphs. We literally were using tickers still 50 years ago. So couldn't even think about it. Why can we think about it today? Well, not because the firms organically chose to do it, because the firms are subject to innovation in a market around them. Innovation and development in the markets around us are largely, believe it or not, the function of government spending, defense, etc., being placed in the hands of private, very innovative companies. Think about most of the big innovations that we have today. Every one of the ones, the electronic things sitting in front of you, exist because John Kennedy said, let's go to the moon. Every one of them. We wouldn't have microprocessors and microchips the way that we do today had that not taken place. Okay? And think about all the extraordinary innovation that comes out of a place like the University of Utah. I mean, we kid about them as being competitors, the big kids out the street kind of thing. They're an extraordinary school. Great innovation comes out of there. Where's the money come from? The National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, predominantly. Okay. So those are exogenous bodies. They're not organic. They're exogenous. So we have to think about exogenous forces, governments, and government involvements. And those are sources of growth, like it or not. Some of us politically think that's not the case, but if you just analyze it objectively, it is. It just is. Okay? Included in this is globalization, right? Would we have today's, in this decade's, rounds of globalization or talks about globalization had we not entered into free trade agreements, had we not caused capital to be virtually perfectly mobile? If I have $1 today, I can spend it in Beijing, right like that. Okay. Used to have to be, it would go through several intermediaries, and the dollar would be 70 cents by the time I could spend it. So we have globalization as part of this as well. What else? There's one other fairly substantial factor that I'm thinking about.
Technology?
Well, technology is going to be in organic and exogeneity.
Government?
That's here in exogeneity as well, Sophia. Think about this. If you had a startup company in Utah in 1963, what was the population of Utah like in 1963?
1963 people.
There were 1,963 people, yeah, right? Okay? And as it turns out, and I have no problem with this, by the way, they're all Mormons, okay? And railroad workers, coal mines. So, very few people. Do we see growth in our industries simply because our populations are larger? Of course we do. Of course we do. Now, the population growth all by its lonesome doesn't get the job done. Because we might sometimes see population growth and at the same time see shifts in consumer tastes and preferences, shifts in technology as such, that will counteract it for our company's particular products. But all else being equal, if 17% of the population uses our products, I'd rather be in a population of 325 million people than 1,963, right? Extraordinary growth. So those are the basic areas where we get growth. And as it turns out, they're also the basic areas that we can think of from changes in return on invested capital. Because growth begets return on invested capital. Because revenues grow, and typically capital requirements don't grow as fast. So in the ROIC equation, no plat divided by invested capital, no plat is a derivative of revenue, right? We start with revenue, we take away expenses, we get to operating income, we take operating income times 1 minus our tax rate on EBIT, and that's no plat. So this is a derivative of revenue, which is a function of growth. But we don't necessarily have to grow the capital of the company at the same rate, right? I bought this printing press, I'm only using it for 8 hours a day. Why don't I add a second shift and use it for 16 hours a day? Okay. I don't have to buy another printing press. Oh, I probably have to spend more money on maintenance and repairs if I'm using it more. I don't have to buy another printing press. My capital need only increased some. My revenue, and thereby my no plat, may have increased substantially, which improves ROIC. Okay? Does that make sense? That's the little conversation that for the last 2 weeks in a row I said we needed to have, but we hadn't quite gotten to. Fair enough? Okay. That's all important to you when we start thinking about forecasting revenues as we think about our explicit periods. Because we're going to have to forecast revenues and expenses in the explicit period to come up with some free cash flow. So revenues, expenses, and capital. Because in our free cash flow equation, we have revenues and expenses combined to help us with no plat, right? and capital is, meaning fixed assets, is inherent in depreciation and net capital spending, and current assets is inherent in net working capital. So we see the whole equation right there. Okay? So I was talking about explicit, and we got off of, we took the side rail there, but I don't think it was unproductive. Hope you don't either. If we have a 4-year explicit period, our 5th year is the first year after the explicit period, right? And if year 5 is year 1, then year 4 is year 0. And my top line is my continuation period, or sometimes thought as my termination terminal period. It's the perpetuity, it's infinite.
What was the red one?
The red one is my continuation period.
Okay.
The continuation period is inherent in the continuing value, right? That's why I don't refer to that as a terminal period. Keep the terms similar. So year 4, the last year of my explicit period, helps inform the next year or the first year of my continuation. I'm going to take whatever my cash flow variable is in the 4th year, and I'm going to multiply it by 1 plus the percentage growth that I believe will take place on into perpetuity. And that gives me the 5th year's explicit values, right? But I use them for my cash flow in time 1 of my continuation. And remember that these equations are the value at time 0 is a function of some cash flow at time 1. So if I've used the cash flow in time 1, which happens to be year 5, it gives me a value as of time 0, which happens to be year 4. So when I'm thinking about the exponent that I use when I discount that number back to today, this exponent, this t in the denominator of the present value, the continuing value equation, is the number of the years of explicit period I have. It's the last number. You've seen that a couple of times now, I think. And I'm sorry if I seem too repetitive and redundant. I just know that it's one of the most counterintuitive things that we do. Because year 0 is 7 years from now. But year 0 is today. Okay? So it screws you up a little bit. It's kind of like when I saw Shelby the other day, or the other week, and she didn't look like Shelby to me. You look a little bit more like Shelby to me. It was mostly the hair. Yeah. Great. Okay. This is a very basic construction. Value is equal to present value of some discounted cash flow, and we are using discounted cash flow during the explicit period, and we're principally going to use free cash flow as the cash flow variable, plus the present value of a continuing value. It is in that continuing value that the different models tend to diverge. So let's look at it. So in the free cash flow model, the continuing value is equal to free cash flow at time 1, which is the year after the last year of our explicit period, divided by our discount rate, I'm using WACC at the moment, minus G. This G is the expected long-run growth rate of the cash flow variable. Now you'll remember that this equation is really just an algebraic simplification of this equation. But this equation, because it's in our continuation, has an infinite number of terms. And we don't know how to calculate that. And as it turns out, it's synonymous out to about the 50th decimal place as this calculation. I like this one. I can get my little head around this one. This is infinite, and I got a finite mind that doesn't stretch very far. Okay? I like this one. There's an algebraic proof in some of the notes online if you really are curious as to how this and this are equal. And if you're that curious, let me know, and we'll go out to the 5 and dime and buy you a life. Okay? Please.
Maybe it's rudimentary.
just raised equal to R.
No, WACC is equal to R. WACC is a discount rate,
Right.
okay? G is the long-run growth rate of this variable. If the discount rate and growth are the same thing, that sets up a bit of an issue, doesn't it? Because our denominator is 0, and this term then is undefined. As it turns out, that's theoretically possible, but principally unrealistic. Okay? All right, so the free cash flow model, in its explicit period, the present value of the discounted cash flow, is the exact same thing as it is in the KVD model. What's KVD stand for, by the way? Key value drivers. And continuing value times 0 for this model is equal to no plat times 1 minus G divided by ROIC divided by WACC minus G. When I say that the discount rate, which is R, and that's a generalized term, generalized variable, when I say that the discount rate happens to be WACC, from what perspective, or from whose perspective, am I assigning a value to this asset? I have 3 teenage daughters. I can outlast silence like you can't believe.
Can you repeat the question again?
Sure. When I use WACC, weighted average cost of capital, as the discount rate in an equation, from what perspective or from whose perspective am I assessing the firm's value?
The investment.
Not the investor, that's just the opposite, the firm's. Because it's the firm's cost of capital. Remember, the capital components are the firm's capital components. The firm's debt, the firm's equities, etc., is the firm's capital
The
components.
discount rate is the investor.
Pardon?
The discount rate is the investor perspective?
Well, WACC is a discount rate. In fact, WACC is a particular form of discount rate. R, which is the generalized discount rate, might be WACC. It might be the investor required return. It might be a hurdle rate of some kind. It might be inflation. It might be an interest rate. Okay? R is simply a generalized variable for a discount rate. And different parties in a transaction clearly have different discount rates. WACC is the one from the firm. Now, required return is probably an investor rate, right? So it's going to be from the buy side, whereas this is the sell side. Okay? Hurdle rate, that's probably also a investor rate, because it's a hurdle rate is a rate that I must get greater than, otherwise I have a problem. That might suggest that I've borrowed the money. So if I borrow money at 6% and I get a return at 5%, am I happy? No, in fact, I'm BK. I got a problem, right? If I borrow, so 6% in that case is my hurdle rate. Now, you could say that WACC is the firm's hurdle rate, right? But the reality is we tend to use hurdle rate as a term from an investor's perspective. Borrowed the money to make the investment. Inflation, well, that could be any of our rate, right? We're all subject to whatever inflation might be. Interest, depending upon where it fits in the equation, could be part of a hurdle rate, could be part of a required return. We know it's part of WACC. So always think about from what perspective the discount rate is being expressed. Now you know who's being represented in the assessment. And by the way, if you're smart, and you are, if you're doing a valuation estimation and you're the buyer, you're clearly estimating it from your own required return. Are you also estimating it from the firm's standpoint? As closely as you can? Yeah. Because the most powerful buyer, or seller, buyer, is the one that understands the other side's argument. I know I can't offer Lisa $200 million because it doesn't even come close to using our numbers. She's just gonna laugh at me and walk away. All right. So in the explicit period, the KVD and the free cash flow construction are the exact same construction. Are they also very similar constructions in the continuation term?
Yeah, I would say it would be,
Pardon me?
yes.
How come? You speak up for us.
Aren't you measuring it the same with this, like you were showing us before?
I'm not sure what you mean by showing you before. Shelby?
Because in the KVD form, the free cash flow equals no.
Yeah, in the KVD form, free cash flow is equal to no plat times 1 minus G divided by ROC, which I think is what you meant, right? So just two different versions of free cash flow, which if we happen to have magically gotten our G right for a period, they're going to be the same number as well. So this term in blue in the KVD construction is simply a substitution for free cash flow looked at slightly different. So they actually very similar. And if you've gotten all the numbers nicely lined up, you're going to get the same outcome. And you've seen that already. Or you know how to get the same outcome if you want to. Be careful when you're forcing the same outcome, because you may be doing yourself a terrible disservice. Okay? Well, that leads us to then the next equation I want to talk about, and that's the forward market multiple. By the way, you're probably not going to see that acronym or that term in very many finance books. It's one that a handful of people use, but I think it's probably the best term. So before we actually go through that model, let me discuss a multiple with you for a moment. Yeah. There are multiples of many, many kinds. There are multiple multiples. We're going to concern ourselves with a particular type of multiple in this course, an enterprise value multiple. EV multiple, enterprise value. And multiple simply means ratio, okay? So that tells us that either the numerator or the denominator in every one of the multiples that we might think about will be enterprise value, EV, okay? And we know that I can take the enterprise value of a company, I can divide it by something. I'll use EBIT to be what I'm dividing it by in this case. And it gives me some number that is the multiple. So if the enterprise value of the company is 100 and its EBIT was 10, the multiple then is 10. Right? That's easy. Well, this looks like a multiple, and I'm going to tell you that this is a valuation model improperly arranged. Because I can rewrite this algebraically such that enterprise value is equal to my EBIT times whatever that multiple is. Right? Just played a little bit of algebra, is all I did. If I know the company's EBIT, and I know what its multiple is or should be, I calculate its enterprise value. What is the number that we are estimating? How would we describe the number we're estimating in our valuation equations? What is it that we're estimating? We're estimating the dollar value it would take to acquire all the rights to all the future cash flows of the company, which is synonymous with enterprise value. We're calculating enterprise value. Okay? So this apparently is a credible valuation estimator. In fact, you've heard probably hundreds of times, well, something goes for a 10x multiple, or something should be 7 times. Kevin O'Leary will look at it and say, well, you know, if we apply a 7 multiple to this or a 6 multiple, this is what he's talking about. Now, as it turns out, we have a whole classification, or a whole class of enterprise value multiples. EV/EBIT's one of them. EV/EBITDA. is another. EV sales is another. EV free cash flow is another. And on and on. So let me pass some of this out to you then, as we think about on and on. Pass that along, please. And let me take one. Thank you. So this is just a little quick sheet. It's got a whole bunch of different enterprise value multiples listed. And you see the ones I've given you right up at front. You can do EV, flat, EV, investment capital. They're just multiples. And the numerator is enterprise value, and the denominator is simply other inputs that we receive from our financial statements or our assessment of. In the column to the right of that is an algebraic derivation of that particular enterprise value multiple. So let's think about that for a minute. I'm going to focus to EV EBIT, and in this class, that's the multiple that we'll use. I might reference others from time to time, but the EV EBIT multiple is the multiple that I am most, I find most credible. Many consultants, evaluators, prefer EV EBITDA. And we've talked a little bit, I think a couple of times, about why I like EBIT versus EBITDA, but I think it bears repeating. If we use EBITDA, which means we've added depreciation back into our operating expense, so we have taken depreciation out of the scenario, I think that we're not recognizing our expensing of the capital asset that we used to make the money. I think if we have a printing company and we're making money by selling printed material that we made by using a printing press, if we don't recognize that press's contribution to our earnings, I think we're flawed. Now, I say that, but a lot of analysts, a lot of evaluators, if not the majority of them, use EBITDA. It's preference. I can compare two different multiples that are both EV EBIT from one company to the next, or I can compare two different multiples that are both EV EBIT for one company at 2 points in time, right? I'm apples to apples. I can't compare EV EBIT and EV EBITDA. Don't mix them. You might end up with a preference for EV EBITDA, or you might be valuing an asset that has sales, but it's such a near term, such an early stage company, it doesn't have a positive EBIT. It certainly doesn't have a positive EBITDA, right? It has no positive operating income. You might need to use EV sales then. And that might be the right multiple to use for the kind of firm you're looking at. So I prefer EV EBIT, but even then, if I'm looking at an early stage company, I'm not going to use EV EBIT. I might use EV sales. There's even a variation that is EV, enterprise value, divided by the units of output of the company. I've seen that used, but only credibly as a comparative instrument for that company at one moment in time versus that same company at a different moment in time. I don't think it's a credible instrument to use to value an asset in a marketplace. That's my belief. Okay? Well, let's think about this for a minute. We said that value, which that we're estimating, is actually enterprise value, right? And we know that one of the estimating equations could be no plat times 1 minus G divided by ROIC divided by WACC minus G. That would be a credible estimator. Now, if that is the entirety of the equation that we use, what do we know about the explicit period and the continuation period in order for us to use only what appears to be a continuation period's estimation equation?
It's equal.
Pardon?
Equal growth, you're saying?
Constant growth.
Constant growth.
Exactly. So, I think I erased it. I did. Darn. in my present value of our discounted cash flow, and I'm red here so I can be working with the red equation, it equals the sum of the free cash flows at times I divided by 1 plus WACC, in this case, to the T. And if these cash flows are growing at a constant rate, and that constant rate happens to be the same as the G I use here, that means that these cash flows and these cash flows are all growing at the same rate, in which case I can just use this equation. I don't have to bother with two of them, right? Because remember, this equation is simply this one add infinity. If the growth rate of the cash flow variable is the same, I don't have to use both of them, I can just use this one. So, if this growth rate, which is also this G, is the same for all the future, if I'm forecasting that, which is a bold assumption, right? But if that's my assumption, or generalization, this is a viable valuation estimate. Would we agree? Nod, shake, Cabo?
No, I mean, so this function is same to the key value driver.
It is. That's exactly right. This is the key value driver form of the continuation term, isn't it? Okay, so it's a credible estimate. So let's go a little further. I want to get to EV/EBIT out of this thing. Can you see immediately how I might get there? Manny, do you remember the equation for no plat? Does anybody? What's the equation for no plat?
EBIT times 1 minus that.
EBIT times 1 minus T. So is that now the same equation? It's the same equation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can you now see how I can convert this to EV/EBIT? How do I do it, Mazen?
Just divide by EBIT.
Yeah, divide both sides by EBIT. No, it doesn't quite look like the equation you see on the page yet, does it?
Okay.
1 minus T.
Oh, got rid of a very important piece, thank you. That would have caused me some pretty serious heartache in a minute. Although, in a second, you're going to see why I so casually got rid of it. So let's try to make this look like the equation you see on the page. Which equation is, I gotta make sure I get this right. ROIC minus G divided by ROIC times WACC minus G times 1 minus T. That's the equation you see on the crib sheet. Okay? So let's try to get from here to that equation.
1 minus T cancels out.
Well, I'm not trying to make them equal. I want to go from this one to that one.
Oh.
Okay? You're right. If I was trying to set them equal to each other, they would cancel out. But that's not what I'm trying to do. So the first thing I'm going to do, and this is why I so casually dismissed this a second ago, is I'm going to move this here. I haven't changed the equation. The rules of products allow me to do that. Okay? Can I suggest that that 1 could be ROIC divided by ROIC? Is that equal to 1?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. My life is getting easier by the minute. So ROIC divided by ROIC. Well, I think now I can combine these two terms such that I end up with ROIC minus G divided by ROIC. My life is becoming simple. Now what can I do to put these kind of in the same vein? I can flip or do some multiply divide magic such that I end up with ROIC times WACC minus G and that then removes that ROIC. And now I have the exact same equation. This equation is simply an algebraic variation of this equation. And you saw how I did it. Now, I'm not going to hold you accountable for walking through the math like that. I will hold you accountable for recognizing that this equation, ROIC minus G, divided by ROIC times WACC minus G, times 1 minus T, equals the EV-EBIT multiple. Okay? And if I have enough of my inputs, I ought to be able to figure this thing out, right? Right, Shelby? Okay. I promise, and we'll practice that on some problem sets and such. All right, let's go back to here then. The forward market multiple model, FMM model, simply uses an enterprise value multiple as its continuation, such that the continuation value at time 0 is equal to EBIT at time 1 times some multiple. Because we said EBIT times a multiple equals enterprise value, which is the same thing as a value. And if we're thinking about it for a point in time in the future, it is its continuing value. So the whole model, the forward market multiple model, would be the sum of the sum of the free cash flows divided by 1 plus R to the T during the explicit period, plus EBIT times some multiple divided by 1 plus R to the T as we bring it back to the same point in time. That's the forward market multiple model. Now, that's all very easy to say. Where do we get M? We just guessing it, kind of like we're doing for G? Yeah, a little bit, sort of, but we're doing a little bit educated guess. Is G inherent in the multiple? Is there a G inherent in this multiple? There is. And I just showed it to you. It's here and it's here, isn't it? Okay? Because EV divided by EBIT is the multiple. So growth, as it turns out, pesky qualifier variable growth is at the heart of almost everything we do. And it's elusive, hard, mysterious, and it's a witch. Okay? We can use it here. Notice I'm not then discounting this or doing any WACC minus G like I'm doing in these. It's not part of the model. Okay? But where do I get this from? Well, if I know the company's enterprise value, can I then look at its enterprise value today, divide that by its EBIT today, and come up with a multiple? Sure. I might be able to observe that, right? So I can see a multiple by observation. But I kind of have to know the enterprise value to have done it. Maybe I've used one of these other equations to calculate the value, which means I've calculated the enterprise value, right? And so maybe I take that enterprise value I calculated for today, divide it by today's EBIT, and I come up with some multiple. Junyun?
So is there a time period for the multiple number?
No, the multiple, as you're starting to see, is a number that we somehow create. And I'm starting to talk to you about how we create it. And what I'm telling you right now is I can think about it in today's time period. If I have calculated using one of the other forms, the value, I've calculated, estimated the enterprise value, right? If I then have an enterprise value I've estimated for right now, year 0, because that's when these equations are all present value 2, year 0, now, right? I can then take the EBIT for now, and I can divide that enterprise value by the EBIT, and it gives me some multiple. In which case, that would be a multiple indicative of a particular moment in time that is now. So I'll think of this multiple now. Okay? Well, that's not the only way I'm going to think about the multiple. can I look at other firms, not unlike my own, that have had transactions in the marketplace in recent history? I can. There happens to be a data source for private firm transactions that's kind of like its MLS listing, the MLS books, because it goes and scours the country for different transactions in the private markets, publishes them in this repository. The most common repository is called Pratt's Stats, P-R-A-T-T-S, Pratt's Stats, or Public Stats, another repository from the same company, or now Deal Stats, Pratt's Stats, Public Stats, Deal Stats. Those are 3 repositories published by a company by the name of BV Resources, Business Valuation Resources. Okay?
What does the stats stand for?
Pardon?
Stats for statistics?
Statistics. Stats is, yeah. Now Pratt's was somebody's last name. Who knows who cares? Okay. There's also something, you probably have heard of this, PitchBook. PitchBook is another data repository of private transactions. So if we can see different private transactions, enough of them, maybe I can see several that are in my industry for firms at about my same size. Let's say between $5 and $10 million in revenues. And that are within the last few years. If I find comparables that are relevant, I can now look at the multiples at which they transacted. Because the dollar value for which the firm transacted is its enterprise value, right? I look at the EBIT that it happened at that point in time, or maybe it's the average EBIT over the prior years, and I now know its multiple. Well, if Walter is in the tire manufacturing business, and Chris is in the tire manufacturing business, and Kaibo is, and I am, and I find that they've each had transactions in the last 10 years, and their average transaction went off at a 7 times multiple, is it reasonable that I should be able to find a 7 times multiple? And that that's the market multiple for my firm. Sure, it's comparables, public comparables, okay? So that might be a place for me to find a multiple. So let's say multiple from a market comp.
What was that third one? Was it Pratt Stats, Public Stats?
Pratt Stats, Public Stats, Deal Stats.
Deal.
Now, as it turns out, Deal Stats is a newly available repository that combines Pratt's Stats and Public Stats. Okay? And here in the next few months, Pratt Stats and Public Stats will go away, but Deal Stats replaces them. Okay? These repositories are not free. You can't just go get them. I pay about $3,200 a year for PitchBook, Pratt Stats, Deal Stats, Public Stats. And for the Duff & Phelps Cost of Capital Navigator. Helps me validate WACC. Okay? And in my subscription, if you're doing projects in a class in which we need to know those numbers, which I don't think you need to know the number, but it's nice to know where they're found. But in my classes where we need to know those numbers, I share my login with the students for that semester. If you're in my evaluation course or the business evaluation challenge, you guys would have had my login. You won't need it here, but if you find that you want to do a project and you'd like to have access to those repositories, just let me know. I'll look at it.
It's not available here at the center?
It is. It's an online, so you're not limited to the terminals. You can do any terminal on your phone. You gotta have the right login. And the logins, I have a login, and they can only be used once at a particular moment in time. It can't be simultaneous logins. Okay, so I'm a little bit restrictive about it, so that I can actually use it when I want to. Okay, so those would be public comparables. Well, as it turns out, Kaibo, Chris, Walter, and myself all have tire companies. Kaibo's company, when it transacted at a 10 times multiple. Chris transacted at about a 5 times. Walter was at a 7.5, and the average there, or Walter was 7.5, and the average is that 7.5. Okay, so we maybe say that that's a good market multiple, but I'm drilling down a little bit more. What is it about Kaibo's company that let him have so much better a multiple? Remember, the bigger the multiple, the bigger the number, right? And the multiple has growth built into it. You can't immediately see it until you look at that equation I just covered up a second ago, and you can see where G is in that. Kaibo's got 10, you've got 5. I know he's got 7.5, I'm saying average about 7, that's my public comp average. But what is it about Kaibo's company? And if, come on Kaibo, I know you're a smart guy, you're aggressive, you're probably all that, but if you can get a 10 times multiple, I can get a 10 times multiple. I gotta emulate what you're doing, I gotta copy it, but maybe I can aspire to be as good as you are. So maybe a multiple can be aspirational. I know that this multiple has been reached at a point in time by other companies. If other companies can get it in my same industry, I can get it. Or maybe I'm looking at my company and what we've been doing. And I know that my enterprise value multiple today maybe is only 7. But you know, not too many years ago, when I did an assessment, it was 10. Can I get back to 10? What was it about the management, the market, my company, our products, etc., that gave me a 10 times multiple at that point? Can I get back there? So that might be an aspiration, it might be a target. Or maybe, finally, and this is not great, by the way, is it possible that my company actually is just operating on nitric oxide right now, and I've got a 12 times multiple, and the reality is that over time, an 8 is probably much more realistic. So my aspiration may be to not burn out my system, right? Or I may just have to recognize I'm riding a wave, and at some point this thing's going to correct, and I'm going to come to an average. So a multiple might come from different sources. You got to think about it. The assignment of a multiple is art. It's like the assignment of G. It's not expressly calculated, but if we know ROIC, we've given a good stab at G, we know WACC, we know the tax rate on EBIT, we can calculate the multiple. Or, and I love this, and this is the right-hand column in that page you've got, if I know my enterprise value, and EBIT, and ROIC, and WACC, and T, can I normalize this equation, reverse engineer it to solve for G? Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Now I got to think about what that G means though, right? So we're back to artistry and interpretation. Does that make sense? Be helpful if I put some numbers to it, right? In-class problem sets. Okay, you'll see these things, I promise. All right, what do you say we take a break? Let's be back functional a quarter to.